he has a second. So hi, I'm Ellen. I am here to talk today about UI frameworks and Scratch apps and playgrounds on iOS and other ways that you can communicate better with your design team and use that communication to help you write better code. Before I get into the how, I want to talk a little bit about the why I'm passionate about this stuff. And the why starts with the who. And so hi, I'm Ellen Shapiro. I am out here from Chicago today, as is obvious by the Cubs hat. I started doing both iOS and Android development in late 2010, and I've been doing both ever since. I've focused more on iOS in the last few years, and for at least the next week and a half before I moved to Europe, I work as the lead mobile developer at a company called Shapiro, which, depending on whether you're trying to tell my parents what we do or whether you're venture capitalists that are thinking about giving us money, we either sell parking spaces or we disrupt parking. And we're in major cities all over the US, including Denver. If you're interested in learning more, let me know. So before I started disrupting parking at Shapiro about a year and a half ago, I used to work at digital agencies for about 5 years, and I built all sorts of iOS and Android applications for all sorts of clients. Now, when I first started out, before I got to the point that Peggy Olson did here in Mad Men, I worked at the Chicago office of an agency called The Nerdery. And though I left in 2013, since then they've gone a little bit more flat design and modern with their pocket protector. And at that time, while Agile had started to become a buzzword and the thing we were all striving for, in practice, almost all of our projects were using the old waterfall methodology. This is the thing where you plan out all of the work of a project in sequence, and then you do it, not really adjusting very much as you go. And the way that designers and developers communicated was basically just flinging designs over the wall to the developers and letting the dev team figure out how to implement them. So we'd start with a single Photoshop document that represented what the app was supposed to look like when it was done. But then the client would have some feedback, or the developers would complain loudly enough about how the designs didn't fit with iOS or Android, and so you get a first revision. But then the designers had basically worked in a vacuum when it came to whether something was going to be easy or hard for developers to implement. So developers would say, hey, this is going to take us forever. Can we get a few revisions to make this simpler? So then you get another minor revision. And then finally, after another round of client feedback, we got a document that everyone generally agreed was definitely the final set of designs and the thing that we were actually going to build. Oh, except for this one thing that they totally forgot to change. Oh, so actually this is the final version. So then the development team would build most of the application, and we'd show the client the progress that we were making. And inevitably the client would realize that there were some things that made sense on paper, but not in the app. So the designers would go back and make some adjustments to their original thoughts, and then send the development team back their updated documentation. Now, God help the poor product manager if anyone had further feedback, because even the designers were pretty sick of the process at this point. But as time went on, more and more projects realized that it was a good idea to get developers involved earlier in the design process, because we could point out places where small changes in a design could go a really, really long way towards keeping a project on time and in budget. And I came to really, really enjoy working with the design team and having a more iterative process. So when an opportunity came up to move to a smaller agency that set up its project to just do that at the time, I jumped at it. And I wound up at a place called Vokal, spelled V-O-K-A-L, because this is the internet and we can't spell anything like the word that it's supposed to be mimicking. And one of the big things that sold me on this move was that Vokal was really, really big on having an agile process. Now, in an ideal world, agile development is as agile as this extremely intense dog is. And Vokal wanted designers and developers working together from project kickoff to the end of the project. And while at the Nerdery, the designers and the developers sometimes didn't get along too well, I was really excited to see what could happen if we were working together from the beginning. Because one of the things that Vokal clearly realized was that often projects are not straightforward. Larger tech projects, which can be completely derailed by rebrandings or changes to the direction of the company that you're working with. Agile is really, really helpful for working with changes like this. Now, there are some things about Agile development which are really, really, really great. But once I started working at Vokal and got into the world of Agile development, I realized that there are some things that tend to feel like ceremony for the sake of ceremony. There are times where the flexibility of Agile that was supposed to be the advantage really started to get subsumed by the business reality of trying to plan and scope projects and trying to figure out how to bill our clients for it. But the one thing that I found over and over and over again was that the key to getting consistency between the designs and the finished product was to make sure that there was a way to allow designers to express their intent in a way that shows up in code. Because if we could capture that intent, we could also make sure that changes got captured. The first thing that we did at Vokal was we wanted to make sure that we were naming things consistently. Using the same name for something across design and development helps immensely because it removes the single largest source of confusion in the development to design handoffs. So there's two ways that I want to talk about consistent naming. The first is to make sure that your developers and your designers are on the same page when it comes to what corresponds with what UI element. It helps to make a quick little table, especially if you're working cross-platform on iOS and Android, so that the designer has a context that when an Android developer asks them about a text view, they're actually talking about a completely different thing than an iOS developer who asks them about a text view. So helping designers understand that different developers may mean different things when they use exactly the same words is really helpful. The next step of naming things consistently is to have your developers and designers speaking the same language when it comes to how individual elements are named. So because even though these are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple, designers are far too creative to use names like that, so they insisted that they're Corvette, Tangerine, Canary, Kale, Ocean, and Violet. And developers, well, often were a little bit more practical, but we're also a little bit more subjective, and so the names of the colors start to diverge. It becomes much harder to actually tell what color someone's referring to, especially across platforms. So there's a lot of stuff that becomes much easier and clearer when you standardize the naming convention across platforms. Because when you name these things the same across both platforms and with the designers, there's no question of what color they're referring to, or what particular style of non-editable text, or what type of button with its associated state changes. Unsurprisingly, it is a lot easier to communicate when everyone is speaking the same language. And the real benefit is that you wind up creating these amazing building blocks that you can reuse over and over again, and which let you build your application faster, more consistently, in a way that's easier to change. It also makes it clear exactly which of a given number of colors, which may look really similar to a non-designer, you're actually using in practice. I always wind up having a section of my color extension that I call 50 Shades of Gray, because designers can never settle on just one gray that they want to use consistently with an app. So having names that are clear makes it much, much easier to figure out exactly which gray they're talking about at any given time. Now, this is really great if you can get developers to do it manually. Generally, that's a giant pain in the butt. So we realized that the best way to move forward was to automatically generate the code with all these things that the designers have intended. Because if we made a robot do it, it was a lot less likely to miss something, and it was more likely to actually get things done. So in order to do that, we had to get designers to use a specified format, which unfortunately, it's a lot easier said than done. So we created an app that allowed designers to work in a more user-friendly fashion and let them make tweaks that they could see. So my colleague Isaac Greenspan, he had done Mac development for years before learning to do iOS. He built a really amazing suite of tools around this in collaboration with myself and Joe Call, who was one of our primary designers. So the main app is called True Colors, and it's been made available as an open source application, which I'm actually really, really happy about because I was super, super proud of this idea and the incredible work that Isaac did to make it happen. So what True Colors allows is for designers to add fonts, colors, metrics, and create these composable styles for buttons, labels, and other kinds of views. What the designer's input is output as JSON, and it can be ingested by any number of other tools. So the Android and web teams actually created one was True Colors Android, and the other was True Colors Less, which is a CSS rendering system. And those are also both open source. The iOS team, we might have got a little bit carried away with the naming. The JSON parser, which powers True Colors, is called Cindy Lauper. And then the code generation tool that we built on top of that parser is called Devs Just Want to Have Fun. Unfortunately, that last piece is still in the process of being open sourced. I poked Isaac about this again. He's working on actually getting it to a point where it can be open sourced. Hoping within the next couple of weeks, I will tweet something as soon as it's up. In the meantime, though, because you already have the ingester and the parser, you can go and use this wonderful thing that Christoph Zablocki's made called Sorcery. It's a command line tool which uses templates to generate code, and you can use it for things well beyond this to generate code. You can take all of that parsed output that's gone back through the Cindy Lauper parser and feed it into this tool or any number of other code generation tools. So this is a little complicated. Why is all of this craziness necessary? How does it help? Because when you're using generated code, underlying values change completely seamlessly. Any changes that you make to the underlying values, like the RGB value underlying one of your colors, or the size which constitutes a medium font size, will automatically and immediately be picked up by the generated code. And it'll update throughout your apps without your developers having to touch a thing. The other nice thing is that name changes break really obviously. If your designer has updated the name of a particular element, you find out real quick when you go to compile. And this allows you to do a lot of different stuff. Now, I know I mentioned playgrounds in this talk, and you're probably thinking, man, she's been talking about this for a long time, but she hasn't even mentioned playgrounds yet. When are we going to get to the playgrounds? And I do promise that's coming soon. But this is about the time where live previews of components for CSS and web development really took off. And there are a number of different tools which help facilitate this for CSS because people who work with CSS and JavaScript really love writing tools that allow them to write less CSS and JavaScript. And at Spot Hero, we use a tool called Uniform. There's a ton of other tools that are like this that allow us to preview our front-end library, along with holding coding standards for front-end and a bunch of documentation on the reusable elements within it. This is what jumped out to me. It's really, really useful because the designers and the developers can see exactly how certain colors will render on different browsers or different screens without needing to wait for the design team to really start anything or to wait for the web team to get stuff to render. They can change stuff like this really, really easily. And I thought this was a really neat idea, and I wanted to start doing this for iOS as well. So I started building out these little mini apps alongside the main application we've been building to take the various generated colors and labels and fonts and put them in these really simple table views so I could distribute a little tiny app on Hotkey or TouchFlight that the designers could actually play with in person. And this is where it became highly helpful to start centralizing all of my UI elements by building a framework. So frameworks help quite a bit in sharing code which is used in more than one place. If you haven't built a framework before, you just go ahead and add a framework in the library target, Cocoa Touch Framework, and that can be added in the same Xcode proj file or in the same XC workspace as your existing application. You'll have to, if you're moving stuff from an existing application, you'll probably have to make a whole bunch of stuff public if you're using Swift because it's now being compiled into a separate module, but you get a whole lot of wins from doing this. So I want to talk about what some of the advantages of this are. You will very, very clearly separate your UI and your business logic. Especially when you have a framework, you're going to be able to tell real quickly when you try to compile that framework what specific pieces are working and which ones are not. If you have more than one application, again, this is where the idea of building that sort of mini app came in, and where this became really helpful was if you're having more than one application, that framework, basically the only thing I had to do to actually get it used in the mini application was just go, hey, application, add this framework as a dependency. And even if you don't have multiple applications, the reusability of a framework can come in super, super handy with the proliferation of extensions on iOS. Apple has so many different kinds of extensions now that they don't even fit on one page of the template selector. These are basically the microservices of iOS applications. And for each of these that has a user-facing part, you either need to make a framework which is accessible from both your application and the extensions, or you need to manually add all of the files to the target. And spoiler alert, having a single framework is a lot easier. Keeping your UI consistent also becomes simpler. You can spin up tests which snapshot your views and compare them to existing snapshots really easily. This is another great way of making sure that the intentions of your designers are documented in a way that's not just somebody writing stuff down. There are a few limitations of UI frameworks, as with anything awesome. There's always a downside. Using ID designables from a framework works really inconsistently, which is kind of ironic since you originally couldn't use IB designables unless they were in a framework. it's very, very frustrating. So one of the advantages that I talked about earlier was not having to add a file to multiple targets. And if you're a heavy user of IB designables, that one might go out the window because in multiple instances, I've had to add the same file to both my UI framework and the main application in order to get UI elements to render properly as IB designables and storyboards. If you don't have IB designables and storyboards, if you've gone to one of the talks about how you can throw all of your storyboards out the window, then great, you don't have to worry about this. This does seem to have improved, I will say. I was working on a Scratch project for this presentation, and it seemed to start to work a lot better, but I found that in practice, it is not really tremendously predictable whether it's actually going to work, which is not really what you want with code. Separation of concerns is also a limitation. So didn't I just say this was an advantage? It really turns out that this is more of a double-edged sword, because there are some places where making your concerns separated, like more generic labels and buttons, there are actually places where keeping things less bound to your data model really doesn't make any sense. Sometimes your view really needs that very specific data model, and abstracting that really doesn't do your code all that much of a favor. So as much fun as it is to do this with the framework, you know, the one thing that would get really, really frustrating with the build, compile, run cycle could get really frustrating, and this is where we finally get to start talking about using playgrounds to communicate directly with your designers. So if you haven't worked with playgrounds before, they're super awesome when they work as intended. You can create one, as with anything else in Xcode, by going to the File menu and selecting Create. Give the file a name, you pick a place to save it, and then you can start writing code and seeing it execute instantly. You can write little functions and have them run, and you can see what happens each time a given thing runs. It's really, really neat because it's a great teaching tool to see how any changes that you make are applied immediately. So you can see exactly the effect of what you're doing in any certain place. You can even add to multiple pages so that you can break up the information you're showcasing into different pieces, and you can ensure that the playground doesn't take too long to run. There's some more fun stuff that you can do if you show package contents on the playground file you created. You can add a sources folder that the user of the playground can't actually see, so that you can use some pre-written code and abstract away the pieces that the user doesn't actually need to interact with directly. Now that's all pretty neat, but trying to get actual frameworks to be visible to a playground is, again, a giant pain in the butt. You can't just add a compiled framework into the sources directory. The sources have to be raw Swift files. They also cannot be Objective-C files. It has to be Swift. I'm still not 100% sure why that is, but I was talking to Stephen Lipton after his iPad Playground session yesterday, and it did occur to me that it's probably because without ABI stability, the compiler that's running behind the scenes in Playgrounds can't necessarily be sure what version of Swift something was compiled with. So that's going to lead to all sorts of undefined behavior, so Swift and Playgrounds are just like, no, we're not going to do that. Never mind. In order to get your playground to be able to see any framework in your application, you want to add it to an XC workspace. If you're already using CocoaPods, good stuff. You've already got an XC workspace. I believe also the same with Carthage. If you're not already using an XC workspace, you can easily add one by opening your Xcode project and saving it as an XC workspace, as you can see in this menu here. You can drag your playground into that Xcode workspace at the same level as your Xcode proj file. And the good news is that Xcode won't even ask you to add it to a target, so you can't accidentally embed it directly into any of your app or frameworks. So you can import any module in your workspace into the playground, including UI frameworks and even your applications module. And sometimes you'll get some really inscrutable errors when you try to do this, and debugging these is absolute hell. However, when it works, it's really amazing. So amazing that I actually took a video of it working. So this is that same view controller that's visible in the sample application that's basically acting as if it is a simulator. And that's because behind the scenes, the live view of the playground running in Xcode actually is a simulator under the hood. So this is really, really neat from a technical perspective. But how do you sell your designers on this brilliant idea of how you should move forward to use some of this stuff? Start them on their iPads, especially if they have iPad Pros. This allows you to introduce concepts without the terrifying prospect of downloading Xcode yet. Start getting your designers interested in what they can do with playgrounds by offering a few really, really simple UI examples that don't actually involve anything from your app. You can create a really simple view. You can show how it goes through the process of changing color and shape and border or anything. You can show them really easily how when they change the background of a color of a view, that can be reflected immediately. You can also show them how to change the font on a button or a label, and that can be reflected immediately. You can also set up button states and view each of them, and you can introduce them to live views, which allows you to see their interactions exactly as you'd see them on screen, which is particularly cool for things like buttons, which have multiple states that are really hard to represent in an individual image. At this point, your designer's gonna go, oh, this is cool. I wanna start messing around with stuff that's more directly tied to my application. Now, making something like this, which is accessible on an iPad from code that you've written for an app, is a little bit easier said than done. It involves the wonderful world of playground books, format of which is spectacularly opaque when you're attempting to view it within Xcode. There are some tools that help you generate everything you need to make this work. Shapiro started, and the open source community really picked up a tool to make it way easier to do this called Playground Book. However, the downside is that this is written in Ruby, so you have a decent chance of winding up in Ruby dependency hell to get it up and running, that's pretty much what happened to me. So you may need to work with the fairly elaborate structure it takes to put a playground book together. Once you get the playground book actually following that structure, you actually have to run it on an iPad to see if it works. So there's a few options for how you can do this. Distributing playground books, you can theoretically do this by going to Git, email, AirDrop, Dropbox, having it be downloadable from an internal site. Unfortunately, email and AirDrop are the only two of those methods that I have consistently gotten to work to get the playground book to show up in your or anyone else's iPad. So even if you finally get that book to the point where it opens on the iPad, you still run into some fairly inexplicable errors trying to actually run the playgrounds within the book. Even, as you can see here, I commented out everything other than hello labels, and it still doesn't understand how to run that. And this can be really, really frustrating. And so until there's a better ecosystem out there for some of this stuff, you're probably going to need to convince your designers that they need to download Xcode at some point. It will make them very grumpy, but hopefully you've already convinced them at this point that it's worth it. So to be able to get your designers a playground that they can run on their laptops, what do you actually need to do? Well, it's actually fairly similar to what you need to do to get a playground book up and running. You add a build phase to your framework, which is a new run script build phase. And then you tell that run phase, hey, I want you to copy all of the source code from this framework into the playground sources directory. And in this example, it's even copying it into a playground book, but you can simply repoint whatever the source root is for the playground into a normal playground, and it'll work exactly the same. Once all of that is copied, you can either zip up or simply AirDrop that playground over to your designer, and they can start messing around with it immediately. So one big thing about using playgrounds to collaborate with designers that you should be aware of is that the process is not really well defined for reincorporating any of the changes that the designer makes. You can use file comparison tools to compare the updated bits of what your designer did versus what was originally there. But the good news about this is that you have an exact reference of what they want it to look like and what they want it to do. And you can see whatever code that they've put in to actually make that happen. That shortens the time it will take to get your code working the way that they want it to considerably. Another option for this is working collaboratively instead of asynchronously. While async communication can save time in certain instances, sometimes it really helps to just sit down and use these tools together. Designers get to see really quickly how the app would react without having to download Xcode and go through all of that setup. You also get a chance to get some insight into each other's thought process. You get to understand, why does the designer want to make this change? And the designer gets to understand why, when I say I want to make this change, are you saying this is going to be really complicated? Having that ability to communicate and have that insight into each other's thought process really allows you to reason through things which aren't explicitly specified, and if you've ever worked with designers, there is literally no way for them to think about every single edge case that you have to think about as a developer. Another thing to be aware of as a possible issue is, concurrency. There we go. Dealing with concurrency in playgrounds can be a real pain in the ass. Animations are really, really cool, but trying to get stuff to work correctly can be super stupid if you're not careful. You have to tell a playground that's actually using any animations that it has to execute indefinitely. So that if an asynchronous animation or network call comes back after all of the code executes, the results are still displayed. You have to be able to tell the playground when to start and when to stop executing, or it's basically just going to sit there and eat CPU cycles and battery for breakfast. The other thing about this is that learning all of the stuff that's still in flux is a double-edged sword. Apple is consistently improving all of this, but when they improve it, they sometimes break the crap out of another part of it. It is another thing that you need to maintain. And in related news, another thing that can be extremely frustrating about making this work with playgrounds is that they're really unstable. Like I said before, Xcode playgrounds run in an iOS simulator if you've created them for iOS rather than for macOS. And that simulator may or may not be trying to run other things at the same time. I'm hoping this will improve in Xcode 9 with improved capabilities for running multiple simulators at the same time. On Xcode 8, this can be absolute death. Playgrounds in an Xcode workspace can have a really nasty habit of either just flat out not working, having the live view screw up a bunch of your other views in Xcode, causing the simulator to hang, or some combination of all of the above. As long as you're aware of this tendency, you can work around it. And you can make sure that your playground doesn't interfere with your main application by being careful about how you're accessing it when you're trying to do stuff both in your main application and in the playground. Getting playgrounds over to designers in easy mode, pretty simple. Hand off via email, AirDrop. You can also use the sync folder if you're only using something that is used on a Mac. Use one single giant playground file. It helps you not have to copy all of the sources into different pages for every single thing. Create your basic elements, but don't include anything complicated. Give the designers the basic stuff that they need to create those building blocks, and then let them go nuts from there. And again, copying and pasting the files into the sources folder, and again, being aware that a single ginormous playground file might be a little bit slow. Getting into advanced mode, automatically generating the code and the structure that you need off of every time there's a build of your application. This is something where you can use a script, like I was showing, to move everything into the sources folder of the playground. You can also use a multi-page playground to separate things. This may cause you to need to use that script to copy things into multiple different source folders so that each page can see all of the stuff that it needs to. But if you're already making a robot do it, making it do it 4 times is not that hard. Letting designers download these things from a consistent place is a really, really helpful thing because they want to know what is the most up-to-date version of this. Where can I go to find this? That's something where if they have to keep annoying you and saying like, hey, where's the most recent version of this? Where's the most recent version of this? Where's the most recent version of this? That gets really annoying for everyone involved very quickly. Playgrounds for designers for expert mode. And this is I like to call this squad goals, because I haven't quite gotten this to work the way that I want it to. Automatically generating the code only when changes have actually taken place in the UI framework. It's something where if you're actually running those scripts all the time, every single time you compile your application, that wastes a ton of CPU cycles if you haven't actually changed anything. Creating a playground book that allows the designers to muck around with stuff on their iPad. This, to me, is the holy grail. This is something where being able to have a designer not have to download Xcode to be able to mess with something themselves, to be able to say, hey, if I make the canary color this brighter color of yellow, how does that actually affect all of these other things? That's sort of the holy grail of what I want to try to do with this stuff. And then finally, automatically uploading things so that the designers can get it on their iPad. It's not just about having something that designers can consistently go to download it. It's about something where it gets sent directly to the designers in a way that it can be opened directly from the Playgrounds application on their iPad. So I have a few parting recommendations for how you can work better with designers. The first one is to start small. As much as you want to try to do everything at once, resist that temptation, because you are going to go down a giant yak-shaving rabbit hole. Start with things which really don't change that much on the fly. Colors, fonts, particularly reusable styles of labels, margins, font sizes, padding. Define some simple sizes so you can compose views based on these sizes. And then you work your way up to things like buttons and text fields and other state-driven UI, things that can change their state, and you can show the way that those things go through the state changes using either a playground or one of these sample applications. And finally, you can actually add your own custom views and animations so that you and your designer can work together to tweak these things really, really, really easily. The biggest piece of advice I have is that playgrounds and UI frameworks are meant to build the building blocks of your applications. And once you build those building blocks, you can do anything. So I got some links. That went a lot shorter than I thought it would. So I am more than happy to answer some questions about either some of the experiences that I've had. I also can show you guys a little bit of a sample code of what some of this will look like. So I've been working on some things here. Please enjoy the monkey for a minute. Recent. So right now, the playground is being a little bit stubborn. So I'm going to go and show the framework. So let me, what is this? Control. So one thing that I want to start with is the UI framework. So this is all, if you actually look in the Xcode proj, the framework is just a separate target that you would see when you're looking at stuff. And you know, the application itself really doesn't do all that much. Almost everything that's happening here is in the framework. I went a little bit nuts with protocols and created a whole bunch of stuff where you can go through and create various types of thing that adhere to various styles. And as you can see, one of the things that I do when I start creating, so you'll have a color style. And so you can see, okay, here are all of the various colors. Here are all of the definitions of different colors of all these things. Zoom back out here for a second. And, oops, perhaps I should actually run the application. And so the application that I built is sort of similar to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the application, whoa, that's a big one. The application which allows you to, oops, come here you go. There we go. Which allows you to see all of the different pieces of UI. So whenever this decides it actually wants to start up, one of the things that you'll be able to see is a list of the various different types of things that are happening here. Now while that's sitting there, oh, there we go. Now, you can do it. I believe in you. It doesn't believe in itself. Come on. There it is. Okay. So you can look at these colors, and you can see, okay, even though these are, you know, Corvette, Tangerine, Canary, Kale, Ocean, Violet, Marshmallow, Midnight, and Elephant, the rainbow colors plus white, black, and gray. And the nice thing that you can do here is if you say, you know what, I actually think that that green color, the kale, it's not really kale-y enough. It's really more, this is really more of like a iceberg lettuce. I really want something that's more kale-y. And so you can leave the same name, and you can just change that underlying value. And once you build and run again, you're able to see this change almost immediately. There we go. Okay. When you go back into the colors thing, you can see that that's that very different color. And one of the things that this allows you to do is say, okay, if I'm looking at a label that I'm composing out of everything, not using breakpoints. So I'm composing these various types of labels using colors and fonts and sizes that I previously defined. If I change that kale, so you can see it's sort of that darker color now. If I go back into the colors, and I say, you know what, actually, I want some nice light kale. I want it not quite, it's dark as it is there. So you can see that color right now, and then you can go back. And that color is going to change everywhere that you have it. And you will be able to see those things reflected within each of the different things that you're doing. And now you can see that that has actually changed back to the original color that was kale. Some other fun stuff that you can do is you can define various sizes. So you can say, oh, okay, hey, what are some corner radiuses? You don't want things to be different sizes. On buttons, this is particularly helpful because you can do things like show what a selected state is. So on this one, when you tap on it, the selected state changes the font color to yellow. On this one, selected state turns the font color to green. This one, selected state, turns the font color to black. Being able to show all of this stuff basically completely without context makes it easy for your designers to understand what are the possible changes that I'm making here. And it's something where it also makes making changes really, really simple. So all of these are hand-generated rather than designer-generated. So if I decide, let's see, where are my buttons? So if I decide, we're still in the wonderful world of Xcode 8 here, so I will have to do the old-fashioned zoom in. I am very, 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 very excited that they added the ability to just use Command plus and Command minus for various things in this. So you can see that that is the extra round size of corner radius, and you can see that's pretty darn round. And if somebody looks at that and goes, you know what, that's like too round. I don't like that. You can easily say, oh, okay, well, here is this other color that we have, or this other size that we have, where you say, oh, that's standard. And run again. And again, this is where the dream of getting this to actually work correctly in playgrounds becomes much, much more important, because you can see that having to build this and run this every single time, kind of annoying. But you can still get that same advantage. So one of the things that I was attempting to get this to do, see if it decides it wants to do it now, is, so wow, that's impressive. So you can try to get it so that things will actually run in the playground in the live view. And right here, I'm basically taking the table view controller, laying it out, yep, and now it's doing that same error that it was doing before, which is why I wasn't originally planning to do a demo. But this is something where, again, this is why I took video of the part that worked. This is something where once you can actually get this up and running, once you have the time to go through and figure out, okay, what is it about this that isn't working properly, this is where you can really see some huge payoff in terms of how quickly you can be working with these things. So I feel like that's a decent sort of explanation of what's happening there. So does anyone have questions? Yes, in front.
So it looks like what they're showing is a really cool tool set. Is the idea that you have sort of a home rule UI sort of widget set, almost like material design?
Yes. So the question, for those of you who didn't hear it, is the idea that you want to create sort of a system of reusable design tools similar to something like material design. Yeah, that's the idea. The idea is that, particularly if you look at anything around CSS, reusable styles are a really, really big thing, and it's something where being able to compose those things and put them together and use them makes it much, much easier to basically have all these building blocks that you can just slap together and create an application out of.
Sure. And the context of my question is that it seems like it's a lot of infrastructure to set up for every single project.
Yes, it is definitely a lot of infrastructure to set up for every single project that you're doing. It's definitely something where if you're working on a longer term project, the payoff is a lot bigger. If you're working on a single project or a company that is starting with a single project, but you have a sneaking suspicion they're going to do more projects that are going to have a very similar UI, that's something that's very helpful. I think the automation portion of it helps a lot with being able to make sure that you've got everything set up, because in an agency environment, one of the things that can be helpful is that you can have somebody who maybe doesn't have work for a couple of days. They can take the time to automate some of this stuff, and that's something that you can use on every single new project that you can do. That's something that I did a couple of times when I didn't have anything to do with Xcode project templates, and it saved us a ton of time. So it's something where, depending on the context of where you're working, taking the time to basically make more of this automated is going to wind up saving you more time in the end.
Sure. I guess my follow-up point is this seems like something that could be a really interesting open source project.
I am hoping to be able to get a lot of this open source. Honestly, I'll be pushing up the bits of it that I've got working so far, and I'll be continuing to update that. I'll tweet out a link to it once it's up, but it's definitely something where I'm trying to at least get it to where it's rendering in the local playground before I actually push it up. So, yeah, thank you for the pushes. Does anyone else have any questions? Yes.
So early on, you mentioned about having the table that would make it easy to collaborate design and your Android counterparts.
Yes.
Biggest tolerance for that need to for this playground type view, is there an equivalent on the Android side, or has it been close enough you kind of squint and pretend it's this is what it would be like on Android?
That's an excellent question. So the question is there a way to do something similar for Android? Because obviously this is a sort of helpful thing. You can do something very similar in terms of taking the styles that you create that are reusable and using it to create sort of a sample app. In terms of playgrounds, you're not really going to see something that's quite like that on Android quite yet. I have a feeling they're working on it, but nothing has yet been announced. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns? I'll be tweeting out my slide deck so that you don't have to try to see blue on blue all that easily. Yes.
I have a white label thing I do where I have a exact list of like color scheme, primary, secondary, tertiary.
Yeah.
You just plop it in Xcode.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of how we saw that for this.
Yeah, I think you're talking. Sorry, I'm going to try to repeat things for people who can't. You're talking about using a plist to define a bunch of that stuff, and I think that's a really good way of doing it to start out with. I think the thing that I like about this approach is that it's more type safe, and it's also something where if you can set up that pipeline of the designer putting stuff into something where they can see what it's supposed to look like, then it gets parsed automatically into code using templates. Then you're able to have an end-to-end pipeline where all of that same stuff gets set up, but it's type safe the whole way. And that's something that, again, particularly working with at agencies, but also working with developers. Like, that is a really, really easy thing to mess up if you're not careful. And so being able to have any system defining all of this is better than having no system defining all of this. I think this is definitely sort of this is a lot of work that went into this. But it was also something that we saw, particularly being in an agency environment, when you have to sort of spin up a UI really, really quickly, you're able to use code generation for all that. You're doing it in a type-safe fashion, and you're doing it in a way that's reusable and easily changeable. And that just saves so much time. Yeah, so the question is, have I had any success using paint code for any of this stuff? I haven't really used paint code very much. I generally am not using vector art for things like that, but I think taking code that's been generated by paint code and moving it into a playground sounds awesome. Like, that sounds like a really, really cool thing to be able to do, and to allow designers to be able to come up with stuff and see how the various things that they're doing in paint code or a sketch file or some other design file can actually be moved into code and can be really messed around with in a way that they can hand it directly to developers and say, this is what I want. Yeah, theming is definitely a difficult problem to solve, especially in the context of a newspaper. So you're, as you mentioned, you're from the Washington Post. There's a lot of newspapers that own many other smaller newspapers, and they still want them to retain their brand identity. But they want to have something that allows you to easily sort of swap in whatever set of colors that you want. And having something that lets you generate all this stuff and helps you more easily inject whatever you need for a particular set of styles is really, really helpful. Like, this is not by any means the only way to do it, but this is the way that I found to be really, really helpful personally, and I hope that it will also be helpful to all of you. I got the 0 from our friend here, so thank you all for coming. If you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to me, either in person or on Twitter at Designated Nerd. I am around the rest of today, or you can just reach out to me at any time. Thank you all so much for coming.